Welcome back to the webinar series with Operation Injured Soldier. And we're continuing on with our desire to move into more hope and specifically address mental health and wellness as it pertains to the group here at Operation Injured Soldier. And today, as you are with us here on the webinar or you are watching after the fact, we're actually going to start talking through what it means to go through the weight of transition and really talk about what does it mean to have life after service. Over the course of my career, I've had the opportunity to do some counseling with service men and women transitioning out of active duty and moving into civilian life. And some of this has to do with how do you approach civilian life? And some of this also has to do with something called career counseling. And what does it mean to shift into a new vocation or a new career? And so we're going to talk through that as we go through, and we're going to have some time to interact and some questions to walk through. But I wanted to start out with just what I thought was a really helpful statement. Transition out of the military service carries a weight most civilians will never see. Life after service is a second battlefield, not marked by combat, but by identity shifts, loss of structure, invisible wounds, which we talked about in our first webinar series conversation, and the search for purpose. And let me just frame this for a moment. Incidentally, last week, I was at a table at a Christmas party with an individual who served for 4 years in active duty in the armed forces and did 2 tours in Afghanistan. And when he returned stateside and entered into civilian life, it took him almost 10 years to get to the place where he could sit in a Christmas party in a room filled with people without having his back toward a wall. And he talked about that in his own journey with that. And as I've journeyed with men and women coming out of combat situations and out of military service, there's a whole lot that civilians just do not understand in that transition. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about as we move into that today. The first thing that I want to walk through is that you have to name it to navigate it. You have to name the realities that you're in before you can learn to navigate it. And you can't navigate it until you name it. To understand the emotional, psychological, relational, and spiritual layers of transition, especially for those carrying trauma or moral injury. And I'm just going to pause here for a second and talk honestly with you as we think through what does this mean for us? What does this mean for you, the listener here, who maybe you were in the service, or maybe you have a loved one who is in the service. Maybe you're a caregiver to someone who served in active duty military. All of what we're going to talk through has bearing in this conversation, but for those who carry trauma, specifically those who carry invisible wounds of combat trauma or some sort of moral injury, whether that was they felt a betrayal or they felt a loss in a specific way. And if you have not had a chance to listen to or watch our first webinar, I'm going to encourage you to go back and listen to that, because if you enter into the next stage of your journey past military service and you're transitioning into the workforce or into civilian life, and you're not fully aware of some of the trauma that you carry or some of the stress that you went through, that's going to impact you. But specifically speaking, and this is, I think, something that's important not only for individuals that I work with, but it's also really important for family members to realize, is that leaving the service is not going back to normal. It's not like you can just push pause on all of the training that you went through. It's not that you can push pause on the experiences you had, somehow hit a reset button, and then just go right back into life before the service. But let's just look at this matter of factly. So you can't go through 3 months plus or minus of intense combat training and your initial boot camp and then go through MOS school and go through essentially a year of preparing for whatever combat situation you might or might not be in. You can't go through that time and then come out of it saying, well, I'm the same person I was before I went in. That's not the way it works. And so just matter of factly speaking, from a neurological standpoint, whatever it is that you've been doing for the last 90 days, that is your normal. And the idea that you can just hit the reset button and go back to life before, it doesn't work that way. And so leaving the service is not going back to normal. It actually means that you are losing a sense of mission. You are losing a sense of identity. You are losing structure and predictability. You are losing camaraderie and shared purpose. You're losing a family. And you are going to go into re-entry into a world that often feels slow, unstructured, and disconnected. Let me put it a little more plainly, contextually, for an individual that I've worked with over the years. A young man who served for 4 years in the Marine Corps, worked his way up to corporal, made some bad decisions, got booted back down to lance corporal, worked his way back up to corporal. And then he moved on to a career outside of the military. And he really struggled within the first year. Incidentally, he never saw combat. He was in a brief window of time where he had no deployments and he had no combat, but he came out of the Marine Corps and moved into civilian life, and he lost all of his friends. He lost all of his connections, a lot of his family and the people that he knew. They didn't understand what he was going through. His specific MOS was military police and specifically corrections. So he worked in the brig, quote unquote. And so people really didn't understand what he was going through. And he really struggled coming out of it because the world looked different. He didn't have the same sense of purpose. He didn't have the same structure. And that was a big shift for him. And that's without any combat. That's without any quote unquote traumatic experiences on the combat field for him to tackle. So that was a big deal for him. And then we had to tackle, and this is something I also have to tackle with clients as I work with them, this myth of a clean break. A lot of people think that transition is a moment, that transition is this short period between what I was doing and what I am currently doing now. And the problem is, it is not a moment. Transition takes a long time. In reality, it's a process that includes grief, which is letting go of what was, grieving the loss of what used to be. Anytime we move from something that we were in or were doing to something new, there's always an element of loss. And wherever there is loss, there is some form of grief. There's disorientation. Where am I? What am I doing? Who am I? What does this mean for me? There is anxiety about finances and career options. So even if you have a transferable MOS, you may be moving into civilian life where what you were doing in the military doesn't necessarily equate to a full-time job opportunity outside of the military. Then there's things like navigating the VA, navigating healthcare, navigating housing, adjusting to new social dynamics and expectations. How does society function here? What is my role in society? What are the expectations that society has on me versus what did the military have? There's a whole lot about that transition that can be really hard. Just another individual I worked with, they came from a family that was in profound disruption most of the time, and they'd never bought a home before. In fact, in his whole family, no one had ever owned their own home. And then he went into the military, and then he served for 8 years, and he had never needed to buy a home. He'd actually never needed to pay rent for himself, and he'd lived on base the whole time. And then when he got out of the military, all of a sudden he had to pay rent for the first time. He was looking at buying a home. He was actually the first person in his family to ever sign a mortgage. That was a long transition for him, and that was really hard. And so it is not a clean break. It is typically a longer period of transition than most people realize. And it is a transition that can carry with it trauma. And this is where it would be helpful to go back and talk a little bit or listen to our first webinar series. And of course, we'll be covering different aspects of trauma as we go through this webinar series this year. But I just want to talk briefly about what does transition look like with trauma as a factor. So if you are carrying post-traumatic stress disorder, or you have gone through some sort of moral injury, PTSD, the post-traumatic stress, that disorder keeps the body in survival mode, making civilian life overstimulating. A young man, well, he was a young man, now he is older, but a friend of mine worked as an infantry MOS in the military, and specifically worked with explosives, and now works as a mechanic on diesel machines. For the first few years of his career, whenever the diesel engine would fire, he would have a really hard time. In fact, I questioned whether or not it was wise for him to have that job, because he was constantly triggered. But for him, he made it a point of order to, when those moments came, do his breathing exercises, work through those stressful moments, because he was determined that that moment, that pain, or those specific instances that occurred, those were not going to take him out, and those were not going to determine how he was going to live his life. But that's hard work, because that can impact the job. Specifically, having jobs where there are lots of crowds, lots of traffic, lots of loud noises, where there's a lot of unpredictability. That can be really hard. Moral injury complicates identity reconstruction. Things like, I don't deserve a good life after what's happened. Maybe you've seen something, been through something, had something happen to you, and there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of internal narratives. And you're saying, I don't deserve to thrive in this job. I deserve to get fired. I deserve to have a crappy job because I've been through this or I've seen this. Those are real realities that people go through. Shame, guilt, anger, or betrayal can all surface, and more intensely when the tempo slows down. So as you move into a more quiet-paced life, as you start to experience what is quote unquote more peaceful, or more of that slower pace in civilian life, a lot of these emotions can surface and feel more intense. And it's a little weird, because when you're in the thick of it, you may not feel it as much. And then all of a sudden, when things start to slow down, you start to feel it intensely, almost as if your body is telling you, hey, this peaceful situation isn't good for you. But in reality, your body's actually having enough time to slow down and finally react to things that happened a long time ago. Transition isn't just about finding a new job. It's not. It's about finding a new sense of purpose. It's about finding new rhythms. It's about finding new routines and structures. It's learning how to inhabit a new world while carrying, and this is really important, an old one inside you. I can't tell you how many times I have talked to individuals who have served over the years, and there's a part of you that always feels like you're still active. There's a part of you that always feels like you're serving. And some of that is because the training that you have is hardwired into you. And that's reality. Now, this isn't true for everybody. Some people do better at it than others. But statistically speaking, these are some things that you're going to face. There are some things to identify with identity and purpose. A lot of individuals suffer what is called the identity collapse. This is where you start to wonder who you are. In a lot of ways, military training is about giving you a new identity and learning how to remember who you were and who you are now. That can take some work. Who am I without the uniform? This is specifically true for individuals who had some sort of authority. So maybe you're an NCO and you had people working under you, or you had people who reported to you. You had a chain of command that you were a part of. And so without the uniform, do people have to listen to you anymore? I mean, the truth is, there is a time and a place for because I said so and you need to do it. And sometimes that does not transition well into civilian life. If you don't believe me, try it in your parenting. The truth is, a lot of younger individuals within the military will listen to you because you said, because I said so, when your teenagers will not. And that is a reality of transition that can be really hard. What value do I bring now? Am I a part of a team now? Where do I fit into this civilian life? When the loss of identity continues, you can see elements of depression, isolation, a loss of motivation, or feelings of like being invisible or not being understood, just being around people who just don't get it. And no matter how you feel, even if you are surrounded by a bunch of people, you can feel alone in a crowd. There are some ways to reclaim purpose, but it can take some work. That's who thrive when purpose is reframed, usually find that they can find strength in leadership roles, strength in advocacy. In fact, I know quite a few individuals who have now transitioned to being advocates for VA benefits and other active or post-active service duty members who need more support. You can find a renewed sense of purpose in mentoring both individuals coming out of the military and individuals in civilian life, serving communities through new missions. So you get involved in nonprofit work, supporting fellow veterans, building something meaningful for the next generation. And again, maybe that's serving at the Boys and Girls Club of America or some organization where you can actually be of benefit to another human life. That's a really great way to reclaim purpose. I want to talk for a little bit about the brain and the body and how this breaks down a little more on the trauma conversation. Trauma makes new environments feel unsafe. It just does. And it's good to be aware of that, especially if you've been through intense periods of pain. When you transition back into civilian life, you have to realize most of what you're going into is going to feel new, which means most of it's going to feel unsafe. That isn't that it is unsafe. It just feels that way. Trauma-associated hypervigilance can impact the workplace where everyone is careless with safety. This is a big one. Especially if you are a part of a faith organization and you're coming out of a combat situation, you go into a church and you're checking exits and you're checking entrances and you're looking at people and you're saying, oh, they're doing this all wrong and this is unsafe. Or you go to a concert and you're constantly criticizing, or you go to a restaurant, you're constantly criticizing safety environments and that people they're not paying attention to that. Well, here's the truth. Most civilian individuals don't think like that. And so that automatically puts you in a place where you feel like you have to be hyper vigilant. Public spaces are too loud or too unpredictable. This is a big one too, like relationships. I don't know how to turn off survival mode where you constantly feel like you're on high alert and you never really feel like you can be safe. In fact, that's a lot of reasons why individuals who are transitioning move into isolation, because it's actually safer to be alone than it is with other people. And yet we need other people in order to feel soothed. There are four core human desires. And if you've followed us on webinars before, or you've been to any of the workshops that we've done with OIS, we've talked about this, but the four core human desires are to feel seen, safe, secure, and soothed. And so we need to be seen and recognized by other people. We need that. It's super important to us. We want to be validated. We want to be noticed. We want to be recognized. We want people to understand us. We also want to feel safe, and we want to feel secure, and we want to feel soothed. Well, if you come out of combat, or you come out of a life where there was a lot of structure, you come out of service, and you move into a chaotic environment, you're not going to feel safe. And so it's easier to isolate, but then you can't be seen. And because you're not with anybody, it's really hard to be soothed. And so you can self-soothe, and usually that's done with alcohol or some sort of destructive behavior, but that's going to lead you into deeper problems. And so all of this makes sense when you think through it, and it helps us understand why civilians don't get it and why veterans feel out of sync with a civilian pace. Fight or flight physiology struggles. Those come with slow environments. Those come with ambiguity. Those come with people who don't follow through. Let me just ask you, if for those of you listening or watching here after the fact, does it ever tick you off when somebody says they're going to do something they don't follow through? Does it ever tick you off because you don't know how to hold them accountable? You're like, man, you said you were going to do it. Why didn't you do it? Is that in any way possible that it's connected to the fact that when you were in the service, if somebody pulled something like that, they would have gotten their ass handed to them? And you're like, where's the accountability? Doesn't that make you angry? Yeah, man, civilian life is different, and it's important to name that. A lack of hierarchy, does it drive you nuts when you don't have when you don't know who's in charge, who's the boss? A lack of hierarchy. In fact, I worked with an individual years ago who worked for a trucking company, and he had like 6 bosses, and he didn't know who his actual boss was. And it drove him insane. And I remember him saying, he's like, when I served, he was in the Marine Corps for 14 years. He said, when I served in the Marine Corps, I knew who my boss was. It was very clear to me, and I have no idea who I report to now. And it just drove him insane. Man, when you're disconnected from social norms, or communication is passive or unclear, this would be another one. Do you ever find yourself saying, just tell me like it is? Just say it. And it gets so frustrating when people talk in circles and are not clear. Yeah. I mean, the truth is, there's a lot about civilian life that is maddening if you are appropriately conditioned. And that's the truth. That's what training does, is it conditions us, or it conditions individuals who have served. It conditions individuals to a different way of life. And so when you transition into civilian life, you're transitioning into a new world all over again. Continuing on here with the brain and the body, just remember that the body remembers. Fear-based trauma leads us into post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Moral-based trauma moves us into shame and belief fractures. The body holds on to that tension. Sensory memory and survival reflexes, all of that groups into trauma responses. And the body holds on to that. So even if the brain makes sense of it, the body can still hold on to it. Emotionally numbing can become a coping strategy. Let me just ask you here, and again, this would be something to think about. When you get into large, overwhelming social situations, do you ever find yourself spacing out and kind of going to your happy place? The word for that is dissociating. Do you ever find yourself emotionally withdrawing in intense situations? Yeah. Truth is, individuals who have gone through hard times and are processing through trauma, that can be a real thing for them. Can be hard to rebuild internal safety. But it's important to have things like grounding practices, regulated breathing, finding predictable routines, identifying safe people at the table or in the room or in your life. And of course, moving into some sort of trauma-informed counseling, whether that is EMDR or another trauma-proven counseling exercise or therapeutic intervention, finding support, whether that's through OIS or through the chaplaincy, which I'm a part of. There are a lot of different ways to help learn to navigate that. Let's just talk about reintegration challenges and just, again, name it to navigate it. One of the challenges that individuals face when they are moving back into civilian life are family and relational stress. Ideally, there's a period where everyone is happy to have you home. Everybody is happy to have you back. And then after that quote unquote honeymoon period, real life sets in. And then there's working through the reality that you were not present for a while, that communication was distant, life moved on while you were gone. If you have kids, your kids didn't see you for a period of time. And that's true both for coming back from deployment. And that's also true for reintegrating back into civilian life. Navigating family tensions and family dynamics. There are unexpected or unspoken expectations on both sides. If you're married, your spouse may have expectations for your return that are different than yours. You might have expectations for them that are different than theirs. Same thing with family, definitely with children. Usually, you're going to feel misunderstood. Your partner is going to feel shut out or overwhelmed. Either you shut them out emotionally or you dump everything on them and they don't know what to do with it. You might have difficulty expressing your emotions. This is a big one. This is a big one for men. Let me just say specifically for the men listening, it is normal to feel uncomfy when you're talking about your emotions. And here's what's really bad. If you feel uncomfy talking about your emotions, but you need to talk about your emotions so that you don't feel uncomfy, you don't know where to start. That's normal. And yet that can be a big part of the transition. Parenting challenges, again, major during reintegration. There's work and career stress. Like, this is what I used to do. Well, what do I do now? I had a friend tell me once they worked as a military police officer and then transitioned into being a CID agent. And I had them tell me once, they're like, hey, I don't have any problems. I could get done with the military today, and then I could walk on to a civilian police force tomorrow with everything I know. And I pushed back and I said, could you really walk on? Is that really the way it works? You're really trying to tell me there's no additional training, there's no additional conversation that would need to happen? There's really no such thing as walking on to the next job. There's usually some sort of training that goes along with it. And though they are similar in nature of education, they are different in the way that they apply. Veterans typically struggle. This may not be your story, but many that I have worked with and talked through this with feel underutilized. They're in their job and they think, I can do more. Why don't they see that I can do more? Maybe they're frustrated with inefficiency. Do you ever get on the job and you're like, why is everybody so lazy? Like, why are people just not working harder? Maybe you have conflict with supervisors because this is a really big one. And in fact, I worked with a young man who came out of the military into the civilian labor force. He had a foreman and that he did not appreciate the way the foreman talked to the employees. And he really struggled because he said, I never had a sergeant who talked to me like that. And he came from this idea of like, hey, you praise in public and you censure in private. And he did not like the idea that a foreman would basically lay into a guy right in front of everybody else. He just thought that was completely disrespectful. And he said to me, that would never fly in my unit. And I said, oh, here's the problem. We're not in your unit anymore. And that was a big hurdle for him. Veterans may struggle with underemployment, not finding enough work, or difficulty finding meaningful work that matters. It's really hard to go from a job where you feel like you have a sense of purpose and you feel like maybe you're making a difference in the world, or at least you can tell yourself that, to moving into a factory where you're parts on, parts off all day long. Some people love it, some people don't. And that can be a challenge. Here's some other reintegration challenges. Relational withdrawal. You pull away from relationships because you feel shame, or your hypervigilance keeps you from being able to enjoy a Christmas party. Or how about this one? I worked with a couple once that here was a major point of tension in their relationship. I know this is going to sound a little funny. If you're a civilian and you're listening, this isn't going to make sense to you at all. But she was upset that when they would go to a restaurant, he would pick the worst possible seating position in the restaurant. He wanted to sit at a table as far away from everybody else with his back to the wall that looked pretty much awful to sit at. And it drove her insane. But the truth is, he couldn't walk into a place and be in an open area where he didn't have some of his back covered. He needed to be able to see all the exits and the angles. It was impossible. And he was constantly reading the room. And it was distracting for her because she didn't feel like he was paying attention, when the reality is he was trained to survive. I mean, there's a lot to that. That can make hypervigilance can really take an impact on your dating life. And it can take an impact on the way that you relate to the people around you. Some people feel like a burden. And they feel really guilty about that. Some people feel like nobody gets it. Nobody understands. Nobody realizes. In fact, the Christmas party I was at, and I shared with you that I sat down with a young man who had been in active duty for 4 years and two tours. He was trying to explain to the table that, he sometimes struggles at Christmas parties. And I looked at him and I said, hey, not for nothing. I do some work with a group called Operation Injured Soldier, and I explained what I do. And he looked at me and he goes, oh, thank you. You get it. And that was enough for him. Just that somebody else understood that, like, he's not crazy. And maybe you're thinking sometimes, am I crazy? Like, nobody else gets it. You can't expect everybody to get it. But it can be really hard. Fear of judgment. Like, you don't want to share. You don't want to talk about it. As people legitimately, they may say things about you or say things to you that you're afraid of. And of course, moral injury can contribute to creating distance. If you've done something or something's been done to you that was a violation of your own personal morals, that can make a difference in your relationships. A couple risk factors to be aware of in transition. Depression is pretty common in the transition from active duty or military life into civilian life. Substance use, again, because if we want to feel safe, we want to feel seen, we want to feel soothed, we want to feel secure. You know what makes us feel really soothed temporarily? Alcohol or painkillers or some sort of a substance. It can also It can also be something that in a pinch makes us feel safe because we withdraw from other people. Anger or aggression, pretty common. Those are some risk factors. Broken relationships. I know of a lot of couples who are engaged during military life and then entering into civilian life, wind up breaking up, or the marriage gets annulled, or they get divorced. That happens because, again, it can be really, really hard if you don't name it. Then, because if you don't name it, you don't know how to navigate it. Suicidal ideation is a big one, and I put this in big, bold statement here. I cannot overstate this enough. The period of transition is the highest risk window for veteran mental health. It is the highest risk window for suicide. It is the highest risk window for depression and anxiety because transition is significant and we do not see it as a journey. We see it as a moment, and therefore our expectations are not high enough to handle it. Let me talk about a path forward. And I'm hopeful here that, the work here that OIS is doing as new individuals come on, and really for those of you who are watching this after the fact, and maybe you do work with VA groups, maybe you do work with mentoring, maybe you do work with training, and you are out there and you're helping younger individuals as they enter into civilian life. I'm hoping that you can help them as well, because there are some steps that you can take in order to be healthy in this transition. Number one, get into predictable sleep routines. Have a set time where you go to bed and a set time where you wake up. And if you have a job that is inconsistent, I want to say this carefully, but I also want to say this strongly. Make sure that you have a job, even if you have to get a different one, if you can afford that or allow that, where you can have consistent sleep routines. One of the best ways to repair our mind, body, and soul is by regular, predictable sleep routines. Make sure you get in movement or exercise. Listen, again, if you were in active duty and you were in the military for a set period of time, your body is used to moving. And it is important to have movement in your daily routine so that your body can process through stress in similar ways that you did while you were serving. Having structured mornings, structured routines to the mornings, not overly structured, but making sure that you have structure to start your day, and break down your goals into small, achievable steps. It's good to want to get out there and hey, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to get a relationship. I'm going to get married. I'm going to buy a house. That's all good. I love all of those goals. If you were working with me, I'd say, how do we break that up into 12 or 15 attainable steps? Because it can feel really overwhelming otherwise. And this is a big one. Schedule connection with other people. If people in your life say, hey, I'm here for you, schedule a time to sit down and talk with them. It's amazing. If we prioritize relationship, we prioritize those conversations, how helpful that can be for us. A couple other things, rediscovering community. There is a reason why I just love OIS so much, their mission and what they're wanting to accomplish. They are trying to get peer groups together. They're trying to get veterans together. Make sure that you're take full advantage of what OIS is doing, because that's super helpful in transition. And remember, that's not a moment. That is a lifetime. That is a season of life for you. Getting involved with faith communities. Again, I'm not here to push my faith on you. But if there is a faith organization in your area, be it a church or whatever, man, get involved, because people are so important in that transition period. Purpose building groups, some mission oriented groups. So maybe that's a serve group or an activity group that you can be a part of that's making a difference in your community. Here's a big thing. Community breaks isolation and restores meaning. And the worst thing to try to do is to go through this transition alone. Don't do that. It's too hard. It's already hard enough. Being alone makes it more hard. being with people gives meaning to our life. And we were, from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, we were created for people. We were made for people. So finding people, that's super important. Finding ways to integrate your story, not erase it. It can take time to talk about what you went through and what military life was like for you, but we won't heal. You won't find healing until you can embrace all of your story and find ways to share that with other people. Transition healing is not about leaving the past behind. Here's what it is about: naming what happened, understanding its impact, integrating trauma and moral injury into a coherent identity of figuring out what happened to me, rebuilding what was lost, and creating new mission and purpose. Almost every individual that I've worked with over the years has found tremendous success in their healing journey if they are willing to name what happened and understand how it impacted them, and finding a way to turn that pain into a greater purpose. That's a really important part of transitioning. And of course, then there's spiritual integration. If you are a spiritual person, allowing yourself the time and the space to wrestle honestly with God about what happened. I mean, if you've seen real evil in the world, it would be weird not to question the goodness of God in all of that. Why would God allow such suffering to occur is normal. Wrestling with that, having a space for lament and a space for truth telling, learning how to forgive both yourself and other people, reframing suffering under a greater understanding of how evil works in the world, and then also rebuilding hope in the presence of God and who He is and how He's working. I want to just take some time here as we come to a close, and I want to present a case study to you. And then there's some questions that go along with it. By the way, if you're following along in this webinar, if you go to OIS's website, there is a worksheet on this entire webinar that you can follow through. It's got all this material printed out on it. And there's a workbook for some mental wellness and emotional wellness tips for you that I found to be really helpful in my private practice and the work that I do with individuals. But I just want to walk through this webinar. I want to walk through this case study with you. And again, with these case studies, I just want to be really clear. These are case studies that are pulled from multiple stories of individuals that I have known over the years. These are not real names, though the themes and the elements of the stories are real. They are not specific to any individual. Marcus is a 34-year-old Army veteran, recently transitioned into a civilian construction role after 12 years of service. Incidentally, can I just say that a large majority of individuals who come into civilian workforce enter into the construction world? That's just an interesting note. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to talk about with you individually if you have curiosity on why that is. But he enters into construction role after 12 years of service. He becomes frustrated by what feels like disorganized communication, shifting deadlines, and a lack of accountability. His urgency and directness, shaped by years of high-stakes structure, come across as intense or aggressive to coworkers. Though highly capable, Marcus begins withdrawing after sensing tension. Internally, he feels unsafe in the unstructured environment, and his trauma-driven hypervigilance is activated by unpredictable communication patterns. He wonders if he made a mistake leaving the military and struggles with his identity, belonging, and regulating his reactions in a workplace that doesn't share the culture he came from. This is a common story. Though it might be different than yours or someone you know, many feel this way. And there's this external structural component, internal emotional component that can really, really play with us. And so just a couple of things. What transition challenges are most evident in Marcus's experience? Well, one, he's got an identity loss. Two, there's a cultural mismatch. Three, there's a lack of structure. And then there is ultimately a lack of misunderstanding. One of the solutions in a story like this or an experience like this is having a third party who's outside of it to help to translate the two experiences, almost like an interpreter. A couple of things to consider. How might PTSD or hypervigilance be influencing his reactions at work? Well, he's definitely got a threat response. That's clear. There's sensory overload, also clear. And then there's safety orientation of like learning, though he feels like things are threatening his safety through miscommunication or a change in schedule, that's not actually affecting his safety. And so there's some work to be done there. And then another one, just what tools or supports or tools could help Marcus function more effectively? Well, communication coaching, that's a thing. Most counselors can help you with that. Grounding techniques, breathing, regulation exercises, things like that. Some peer support, maybe through a support group or just another veteran who could mentor. Educating his coworkers. Sometimes a third party can do that. In fact, so that's some of the work that I do in the chaplaincy is I work with bosses and managers to help them understand how individuals who have served in the military may or may not respond the same way to leadership structures. And then setting clear expectations for him and for those around him. So that's our case study. And I encourage you to, as you go through this webinar, just go ahead and download that worksheet and take a look at it for yourself. Maybe think through, are there parts of this case study that resonate with my own story? And now I'll just take a minute and pause in case anyone has any questions. And so David, we've got you on. So you are literally a captive audience. You are welcome, David, to ask any questions that you want. Or if anybody on the OIS side wants to ask anything, we can tackle that as well.
I don't think I have any questions right now. It's most of that stuff you were talking about, the guys that I hang out with deal with most of it. It's the PTSD support groups and peer support groups has been the way that we deal with it.
Yeah.
So it definitely helps.
Yeah. Well, and the truth is, I think the peer support groups are helpful because you realize, oh, everybody goes through this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's not just me. Like this is a thing for everyone. And that's part of the battle.
Yep.
Yeah.